6, 7, 8.
Discover, connect, engage, become. Discover, connect, engage, become. Discover, connect, engage, become with CURNcast.
Welcome back to another episode of the CURNcast, where we are breaking down barriers to research. I'm your host, Lauren Ocano, and on today's episode, we're going to have a chat with Dr. Lyn Baldwin, who is a professor, an author, and an artist at TRU. I'm very excited to share our conversation because we're talking about one of my favorite topics in research, which is knowledge mobilization. So, let's get into it. I would like to acknowledge that the CURNcast is being recorded and created on the traditional and unceded territory of the Tecumloops to Secwepemc within Secwepemcúlecw. I am very grateful to be able to learn, play, and create on these beautiful lands. Welcome to our special guest of today, who is Dr. Lyn Baldwin, professor of biology, and who's also an author and an artist. And so I'm really excited to have you on the podcast today to talk about something that's really exciting in research, which is knowledge mobilization. And on the CURNcast here, we're really focused on debunking research myths and talking about research in abnormal ways that make it seem normal. So normalizing research and exploring different ways that we can talk about it. So we're very excited to have a chat with you today about some of the work that you do.
That's great. I'm very, very pleased to be here.
Awesome. So to get us started, Lyn, I want to do what we call a lightning round of questions. So the first question is, what is the last thing that you researched?
Care.
Interesting. What is your current research interest?
Oh, I'm going to use a word that I hate, and I'm giving you fair warning: how to operationalize care.
Ooh, I like this. I feel like we need to do a whole other podcast on this. Who is your research muse?
Oh, multiple answers to that. I think that we always walk in the footsteps of our elders. And so there are people who have pushed the boundaries of research 10 or 15 years before I was at the similar point in my career. So there's an amazing woman named Robin Wall-Kimmerer who, like me, studied bryophyte ecology and also started to write creative nonfiction. And then there's another woman in British Columbia, Dr. Nancy Turner, who's become a good friend of mine and has really broadened my understanding of the ways we need to speak, think, and feel about plants. We're both trained in botany. But so those are the people, those are my human elders. But I think the muse that I turn to most and have thought most deeply about is the subject of my entire research program, which is what I call the green back of the world. Those are green neighbors.
So much to unpack there, but I love it. What is your research superpower?
A willingness to cross boundaries.
That's a great one. And what do you wish more people knew about research?
I think I wish most that people understood its inherent multiplicity, meaning that I'm not even sure, which I was thinking about this coming into school today, I'm not even sure if I really like the word research because it inherently, it is not a part of our common vernacular, so people tend to isolate it. But if what I wish that people understood about research was that often it can be embodied in our daily practices. And so that is something that integrates it and takes it away from this isolated place and makes it part of our life, something that we should care about. And, this is a button. I think people have been doing research since time immemorial. And when we hive research off, then what we basically do is we devalue all that came before. And I think that broadening our understanding of research, valuing those arenas of research that the dominant worldview is quick to minimize, like the research that happens in kitchens and in basements. That's what I wish most. I wish people, if I had any wish in the world, it would be that we saw the world through a mode of inquiry and we embraced more different types of inquiry.
I love that. And our last answer for this round is if you could share a message with future TRU student researchers, what would that be?
That I don't think you know a discipline until you practice it. And for me, research is inherently the practice of a discipline. So if you're passionate about something, then understanding that putting that theory into practice, that is research.
Now I want to give our listeners a bit of background about who you are and how you even got involved in research in the first place. So I'm curious about your research journey and how that all started.
I was thinking about this question as I was coming into work today, and what popped in my mind was a quote from the educational theorist Parker Palmer, who says, "We teach who we are." And I've always interpreted that quote to mean that we find our strengths as a teacher when we understand what skills and capacities and abilities we can bring to the classroom practice or our teaching practice. And I think the same thing is true for research. And that's not surprising because I don't really separate teaching from research that much. So I think we research who we are. And when I think about that in my own life as a young adult, I had no idea what a researcher was. To put it simply, I am the adult child of hippies who went back to the land in the 70s and I was raised most of my life without electricity in the middle of big gardens. And so the notion of a researcher that worked and lived in a refined space, a chemistry lab or a botany lab, that was so far out of my worldview, it didn't even register as a possibility. I think what pulled me in, one of my botanical heroes is the great plant geneticist Barbara McClintock, who talked about her greatest breakthroughs developing less from explicit statements of fact and more for what she called a feeling for the organism. So I think I research who I am. My research grows directly out of my lived experience as a child and then as a young adult, being displaced from the landscape from which I knew best. And my research journey, in the sense, I mean, I never aspired to be a university professor, largely because I didn't think it was possible. So that I think that that's really important because, we understand about privilege in today's world, and we understand that those people who are raised with a broader notion of the possibilities that are open to them may see research as more accessible. They may take on the mantle of doing that independent inquiry sooner, but that doesn't mean that that's not where you might end up.
Welcome to Hit the Streets. I'm Hannah.
And I'm Julianne. This is a segment where we ask strangers weirdly specific questions about research.
Now, let's hear from our first victim. Where do you get your information?
Well, it depends. Usually I just Google it. If I don't find the source online, I'll go to either advisor or the prof directly.
Social media or on websites.
Honestly, just Google whatever comes up in the little text box. Or
the suggested questions or whatever.
Yeah, I love those.
Probably YouTube and TikTok.
I think for me, honestly, Google is the last option. I watch YouTube quite often just to see highlights for sports.
Well, mostly the internet, specifically.
Break it down.
Honestly, Instagram, especially now, since COVID, Instagram is I get a lot of information, a lot of infographics on there nowadays. and then probably from friends, then information, just word of mouth.
If it's something that's not very important, if it's music or sports related, internet. But if it's like internet searches, if it's something school related, I want my sources to be a little more trustworthy and would be a little more pointed and looked at databases and things of that nature.
Like Google mostly, like whenever I need to know something, I just Google it.
I think I also fall under social media just through like Twitter. It's hard to find information quickly, so Twitter is a good place to start and then move on to more reputable sources later.
As we know, mostly everything's like accessible on internet, and furthermore, if we need any information, there are a lot of AIs present now, so we just put a question on maybe chat GPT, or there's so many other artificial intelligence, so like there's an AI generated answer for all the questions we have.
Through scholarly sources and chat GPT.
I'll search it up, and if it's from a credible source like a government website or like ChatGPT, I'll ask ChatGPT.
I would just say through like books or anything that I read that's not on the internet, typically.
It has to be credible, it has to be real, you don't want it to be fake.
And that's it for question 1. Now back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Totally. And now you're doing such amazing things. And that includes teaching. That's, why you've been recommended as a guest on the podcast, because of students who love what you do and have learned so much. And one of the things that they love about what you do is when you talk about ways to mobilize knowledge. So I'm curious what knowledge mobilization means to you.
I think it's a great question. And one of the reasons I love interviews like this is because they make you actually look back or think about the norms that you take for granted and the assumptions that we make. And so your question that you gave me earlier asked, how do you mobilize knowledge academically? And that was a great prompt for me, because it made me stop and consider and say, I don't know really what the word academic means. And I love words. And so the first thing I do is I go search the etymology, the origin of a word. And up until this last week, I didn't know that the word academic has its origins. It refers to the place where Plato taught, a grove of trees outside Athens. So for me, a place with trees where teaching was going on, that I can get behind. The notion of academic as being something that happens in peer-reviewed literature, and there's lots of questions about privilege and predatory behaviors about peer-reviewed journals. And we need to really make sure that we're understand the practices that go into peer-reviewed literature. At the same time, they're often the currency of the scientific discipline, which has raised me as a educator and a researcher. So I think it's complicated. But when I was thinking about all of this, what I realized is I don't believe that there is a separation between academic dissemination of knowledge, or there shouldn't be as clear-cut or artificial separation between the two. If I think about the academy as a place where teaching is going on, then I think that all of the different types of dissemination I do fit within that, because ultimately we can research for all different types of reasons. Some people are just on the hunt of pure discovery. Others are researching for change because there's a need. And both types of research, I would call both types of scholarship equally valuable. I think other types of scholarship, the change or the need is to come to grips with who we are and what we are in today's world. So how do I mobilize knowledge academically? I would say all of the work that I do is academic knowledge mobilization. It just takes on different forms with different audiences. And I think that that's the most important thing. I mean, over the course of my career at TRU, peer-reviewed publications have been important. Book authorship has been important, but so too has been going in to school classrooms.
So I'm curious to talk a little bit more about some of the books that you've written. I know that there's maybe one that's more recent that you might like to talk about a little bit.
Thank you. Yes. So the greatest dilemma I feel as a researcher, or the greatest challenge I feel as a researcher, stems from a teaching I learned from an amazing Indigenous scholar named Irene, who used to be a dean at TRU. And we walked the same trails in Kamloops. And at one point we were standing up in the grasslands, and Irene told me I was worrying about something, about whether to do something or not do something. And Irene said, Lyn, the lesson that I have learned from my elders and my community is to always evaluate what it is you're doing in how is what you're doing today supporting those who came before and those who will come after. And I try to have that feed in because, I always say, and I think, Lauren, I've told you this before, the only academic credential I have in the world is an academic credential to count plants. And I love counting plants. There is nothing, because often when you're counting plants, there's the chance that you're going to find somebody you don't know. And the glory in meeting another one of our green neighbors is, it's the thrill of the hunt. It's the excitement. That's amazing. But I also think that the downside of traditional academic publishing is that there are not that many people who read that literature. And frankly, if you read that literature, and if that's all we had for our descendants to read 200 or 300 years from now, they would really worry about these people who were their ancestors, because the literature is not great writing. It's not inspired writing. There's very little lyricism, if any. There's no poetry. But the world is in a place, when we think about what needs to be done today, lots and lots and lots needs to be done. But the stories that are dominating many of our potential places of change are these dry, factual, incredibly important, but not necessarily inspiring stories. So about 10 years ago, I started to think about what abilities and capacity did I have to contribute to a different story. And that has led to a series of essays, of illustrated essays, because art is a big part of my research practice. A certain type of art. I'm careful about that because I'm first and foremost a scientist, but a certain type of art is a part of my research practice. And so it led to a series of illustrated essays that were published in multiple journals, literary journals. And it's really publishing those essays taught me the craft of writing for a broader audience than just the population of scientists I was raised up originally in. And so the collection of those essays is now coming out this spring. And the title of that book is Drawing Botany Home, A Rooted Life.
Very cool. I want to read it already, right now. Next, you touched on it a little bit, but really, so the why you decided to look at these other ways of mobilizing knowledge. You touched on being able to reach a broader audience. So do you find that your work has allowed you to connect in meaningful ways with community?
So I was on sabbatical last year. And I did not know this until I published a book, but there's such a lead time in the publishing world right now. So the book that is coming out in April, the manuscript was finalized a year ago. So I finalized that manuscript in the first couple weeks of that. I had a year to focus on research, and the project I've been working on right now is really trying to celebrate and illuminate the lives of people who live their lives alongside plants, whether those plants be exotic or not or native, whether they be in a garden or a greenhouse or a historic ranch, or on a new farm that is a retired couple's clearest course of action to help heal the world. And so what I've been so grateful for is by taking on this particular mode of scholarship, it's brought me into the community in ways that I just feel so privileged. I, spent a part of the summer visiting a historic ranch that's in between here and Monty Lake. And it is an extraordinary privilege to be able to walk those fields and pastures. Likewise, it's a privilege to get to see the practices that people are cultivating with plants in all of their different dimensions. So if there's one thing a university can do, it can turn a mirror on the practices that we take for granted that have been normalized to be trades rather than academic work. And by me visiting some of these places, I don't know if this is completely true, but I hope it tells those people who are doing this really, really important work that somebody values it. Somebody finds what the work that they're doing, the decisions that they're making worth celebrating or worth explicating.
And then you start to build and develop these relationships and it just flourishes from there.
Yeah, so I mean, it was a great joy for me to spend time on these properties and then tell them that their properties were going to be profiled in the art show I had collaborated with several other artists in Kamloops this summer. And I think I really hope it impacted them, that they could see their pastures and their gardens and drawn as lovingly and as complicatedly as I could on the page, because none of this is easy. We live in a time where reconciliation is one of the most important things we do. And for me as a scientist, part of what pulled me into this work is knowing that botany is a colonial science, period. And so the question of how you decolonize something whose entire structure, whose very grammar privileges global knowing over localized, the scientific names of all plants is written in Latin. And why are they written in Latin? Because that's a language that was more easily shared. And that is something we have to reckon with, that we are not, I think we are only beginning to understand the magnitude of the task ahead of us.
Hey, welcome back to Hit the Streets. Hear that funky music beat? Let's hear from question 2 now.
In an ideal world, where would you get your information?
Most likely through like a library of some sort, or probably a library, ChatGPT still, so.
Just like any reliable source. There are some really helpful teachers that I trust enough.
Ideal world, it's highly subjective. It depends on what ideal world is for everyone. For me, right now, whatever it's going on using artificial intelligence, I'm getting my answers easily, so it's working out pretty great.
Probably the new AI tools that we have today nowadays that'll be the ideal source. If it's more optimized and has more accurate information, that'll be the most ideal way.
Most likely probably from AI, artificial intelligence. It will probably do a study on us, utilize our behavior, and it will customize all the news that I want. Probably, for example, if I want political news and sports news, probably it should give me those kind of news. I think most probably from AI.
Straight from the source, probably. Yeah, I would say the same. Talking to a professional or whatever, if they knew specifically what I was asking.
Even if we are in an ideal world, internet is the fastest and the easiest way to get information.
In an ideal world, it would be from mixed sources, books, internet, people, interviewing people, something like that. But again, we don't have access to all the resources, so I feel like the internet is the most accessible, easy way to get information.
Ideally, it's hard to get unbiased information these days. A lot, like especially on Instagram, I follow people who I have similar views to, so that's definitely a bias right there. So yeah, ideally, it's awesome. The internet's great because it's so accessible. But yeah, an unbiased information source.
In an ideal world, we would have nothing but trustworthy sources, but unfortunately, that's simply not the case.
Well, that's it for question 2.
See you next time on Hit the Streets, folks.
I can tell that a lot of reflection has gone into this, and you're so right. It's so important, and that's where you really start to see the power of research in these contexts.
Yeah,
So-
and I think that one of the things that as a university we do really well is we embrace research, and we embrace research that isn't afraid to cross boundaries, like I say, the only thing I have any kind of credentials in is how to count plants. And the very fact that I've been encouraged and supported to peek out beyond my little box of counting and plants to say, oh my goodness, I'd never realized this practice that has given me so much also carries this legacy within it. And I think as a university, we are also uniquely positioned to say, how do we serve the needs of our community? If we take wise Irene's question, how is what we're doing today serving those who came before and those who will come after, then it pits everything we do, the teaching and the research, as service to the world. And when we live in a world that is still incredibly glorious, but it's wounded, it's bruised, it needs some attention, it needs some service.
That's very beautiful, Lyn. So I'm also curious to know, do you have a favorite, like if you were to just do what you do, what does that look like? Or is it a combination of all the things?
Well, it is. I like to surprise people. Like I like to I love to give them glimpses into the world that they might not have seen. So last winter I worked with a group of local artists, and I took them into the botany lab, and I said, let's cut up plants and let's stain them. And I want you to see the crystalline beauty that lies at the heart of every single stem of our green neighbors. So that's really fun. But when I was thinking about this question, what I realized is we teach who we are, we research who we are, and who we are is largely defined by what we do. So my favorite thing to do with anybody, it doesn't matter who they are, is to get a bunch of art tools and take them out into a landscape. I don't care, artificial, cultivated, of the grasslands that I love so much, a wetland or a wet forest, and show them how easy it is to start using art and science to pay attention. Because I think of this world as incredibly beautiful. Richard Dawkins once said that evolution is the greatest show on earth, and it is. But so too is the living moment. Like right now, there is such beauty. There is such drama. There are so many surprises. If we can remember to pay attention. And so art has been a tool where I put watercolors and pens and pencils and a couple simple things and say, let's color the day. Figure out what color green that is. It's kind of sap green, but I think it might also be a little bit viridian. So let's dabble in colors. Let's try to figure out how you put the sky in the reflection of reflective surface of a pond. And that's my favorite. That's my favorite because it brings inherently people to thinking about the science. Like, why is the sky blue? Of all the colors it could be, why is the sky blue? And that brings up questions of physics and the scattering of light. And at the same time, you're making space for people to play. So one of your early questions was, what have you been researching most recently? And I said care. And I think because the world is hurting, the most important thing in my mind I can do is cultivate care for the world, and that's all inclusive, which is what's so hard about it. But then how do you operationalize that care? Like, yes, we care for those people in our family, we care for those people we grow to love, but how do you care for this big battered world? And I think you operationalize care by the practices you cultivate. So I see my research as advocacy in some fashion, and my favorite way to educate people is to give them the tools to fall back in love with the world.
So Lyn, my last question for you today is there anything else that you would like to say to students and our listeners about research or about knowledge mobilization in general?
You always keep learning, and now I think that when you've been doing it a certain number of years, then you start learning about how you step back and let other people lead. What I think about research, I don't think about books. I don't think about data sheets. I don't think even about beautiful paintings in museums. All of those are important. But what I think about is that this amazing cultural evolution that has occurred, all researchers ever do is for the time that we're involved in it, we pick it up and we carry it along with our enthusiasm. And we just make sure that we inspire others to pick it up when we're done. And that's what I think about if you for students thinking about research, is that this is an obligation, a responsibility, and a privilege to help carry that excitement for understanding the world, for hearing the poetry of the world, for finding new collaborations. All we're doing is picking that up and carrying it forward. And I really think, and I hope I'm not overstepping here, but I think about that practice is that is really more of an oral tradition than it is a written tradition. That excitement to get excited, like when you worked with Kingsley, I don't think you got excited to do that because of the papers that you read. Yes, the papers help, but it's carrying that passion and like, this is so cool. And that's what I think is that the world, it's a cliche, right? We use it as a cliche, but the world needs you. And much is needed, and part of it is needed to take that capacity for inquiry in all different ways and carry it forward so that when you're done, there will be enough excitement raised in the generation to come behind.
Wow.
That feels like
that feels really good.
Without putting too much burden on the next generation.
Yeah, but that's, if I could use one word, it's inspiring, and also we carry the world, and also everyone in it has a place, has a voice, and in some way is and can be a researcher. That's right. And it doesn't always look in the traditional ways, as we mentioned. And I really love everything that you've illustrated today. So thank you very much for spending some time and sharing your thoughts, Lyn. I thought it was very beautiful. And if anything, you've inspired me to continue doing research in different ways in my life. And I'm sure our listeners will also feel the same.
Great. Thank you. It was a pleasure chatting.
I'm so blown away by these conversations and seeing how creative we can get with the ways that we present our knowledge. I want to thank our special guest, Dr. Lyn Baldwin, again for sharing her story, and I hope it inspired you to start adding creative elements into your research. We'll see you again next time on the CURNcast. Let's continue to break down research barriers together.